April 1945. American soldiers entered Buchenwald and found lampshades made of human flesh, tattoos still visible beneath the lacquer. Survivors pointed to one name, the commandant's wife, the woman who walked through roll calls choosing which skin she wanted next. Ilse Koch. The smell reached them first, a thick sweetness that coated the throat and would not leave. Private First Class. Harry Gruber had known death before in the frozen fields of Bastogne and the burning rubble of Cologne, but nothing had prepared him for this. The gates of Buchenwald stood open on April 11, 1945, and the men of the 6th Armored Division entered in silence. Skeletal figures emerged from wooden barracks, striped uniforms hanging from bones, eyes too large for hollowed faces. Some wept. Others stared as if the soldiers might disappear. While Gruber was ordered to clear the SS officer's compound, the commandant's quarters were abandoned but immaculate. Polished wood, framed photographs, a vase of dried flowers on the sill. Then he saw the lampshade. It sat on a desk near the window. Pale, smooth material stretched tight across the frame. He stepped closer. Beneath the lacquered surface, he saw lines, shapes, a faded image of a ship. A medic named Carlson touched the surface and recoiled. "Human skin," he whispered. Nearby, a book cover bore the tattoo of a dragon. Another displayed a rose and a woman's name. Survivors gathered outside speaking in broken German and Yiddish. They repeated one phrase, Die Hexe, the witch. They spoke of a woman on horseback riding through roll call, pointing at prisoners, studying their tattoos. Days later, those men would vanish. Gruber found a photograph in the desk drawer, a woman smiling with 3 children. On the back, one word, Ilse. And now, before this story unfolds further, may I take a small portion of your time and subscribe to this channel. Join thousands of history lovers on this journey through time. If this tale has earned your attention, a like and a comment go a long way. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? These stories have traveled centuries to reach you. Let us continue. Dresden in 1906 was a city of Baroque spires and cobblestone order. The Elbe flowed beneath stone bridges, while opera halls filled with music and factory chimneys marked the horizon with ribbons of smoke. On September 22nd, in a modest apartment on the city's industrial eastern edge, Ilse Koch was born. Her father, Friedrich, worked as a foreman in a machine parts factory. Her mother, Anna, kept the household and stretched each mark until it nearly tore. The apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and coal dust. Neighbors shared stairwells and gossip. Church bells measured the Sundays. Teachers at the local school recorded Ilse as quiet and unremarkable. She followed instructions. She made no trouble. Nothing in her early years hinted at what she would become. Then the world she knew collapsed. The Great War consumed a generation and left Germany shattered. By the time Ilse reached adolescence, the streets of Dresden had changed. Soldiers returned hollow and broken. Her father lost steady work as factories closed or converted. Inflation devoured savings overnight. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks by morning and billions by evening. Young Ilse watched Freikorps paramilitaries clash with communist agitators on the same streets where she once walked to school. Blood on the cobblestones, shattered glass. The old order was dying. She trained as a bookkeeper and found work at a cigarette factory filing numbers and processing wages. She was not political. She joined no party. But she absorbed the ambient bitterness of a humiliated nation, searching for someone to blame. The ground beneath Germany was shifting, and Ilse Koch was learning to watch and wait. The war ended, but the suffering did not. Germany in 1919 was a nation broken by defeat and bleeding from wounds that would not close. The Kaiser had fled. The new republic struggled to stand while enemies circled from within and without. In Dresden, the Köhler family felt the collapse in daily indignities. Friedrich lost his factory position when production halted. He found odd work when he could, but pride made idleness unbearable. Anna queued for hours for bread that cost more each morning than it had the night before. By 1923, a wheelbarrow of banknotes could not buy a kilogram of flour. Ilse was 17 when she watched neighbors burn furniture for heat, and she saw men in threadbare army coats begging on corners where they once marched with flags. In the streets, the new order fought itself. Communist cells clashed with Freikorps militias. Windows shattered. Bodies lay in gutters until someone cared to move them. Newspapers screamed of betrayal and humiliation. The Versailles Treaty. War guilt. Reparations bleeding the nation white. Ilse did not march or shout or join. She was practical by necessity. She enrolled in secretarial courses and learned bookkeeping. Numbers did not lie. Numbers could be controlled. She found work at a cigarette factory in the city center, filing invoices and calculating wages for workers who had less than she did. She was not political. She did not hate anyone in particular. But she absorbed the lesson the times were teaching. The old rules had failed. An order had crumbled. And in the chaos that followed, those who waited and watched might find their moment to rise. By 1932, Germany had grown weary of chaos. The Republic was failing. Unemployment had reached 6 million. Banks collapsed. Families starved. And into this void marched columns of men in brown shirts promising bread and order and national rebirth. Ilse Koch was 26 years old. She had spent a decade filing papers and watching others rise. She had no husband, no wealth, no particular prospects. When a friend mentioned that the local NSDAP office needed experienced secretaries, Ilse saw only opportunity. She joined the party on May 1st, 1932. Membership number 1196716. The decision was not ideological. She did not study the party program or memorize the Führer's speeches. Jensen, she wanted steady work and the respect that came with belonging to something larger than herself. The office was orderly and purposeful. Men in crisp uniforms spoke with certainty about Germany's future. There were rallies and banners and songs that made the blood move. Ilse typed correspondence and organized files and watched. She noted who held power and who sought it. She observed how ambition dressed itself in ideology. The party offered community for the isolated and status for the overlooked. It asked only loyalty in return. Ilse gave it without hesitation. She did not ask what the party might demand of her later. She did not consider where the marching columns might lead. She saw only the next step on a path that finally seemed to be rising. The uniform, the belonging, the order she had craved since childhood. And so she climbed, but one rung at a time, blind to the darkness waiting above. Karl Otto Koch was born in 1897 in Darmstadt to a family of minor civil servants. He learned early that authority was something to be seized rather than earned. At 19, he marched into the Great War and returned 4 years later with an Iron Cross and a hunger that peacetime could not satisfy. The Weimar years found him drifting between failed business ventures and petty positions. He married young and divorced quickly when his wife proved insufficiently useful. By 1931, he had found his calling. The SS offered men like Karl what the broken republic could not: purpose, power, permission. He rose quickly through the ranks. Superiors noted his organizational abilities and his comfort with violence. But he understood that the new Germany would be built on controlled brutality, and he was eager to supply it. In 1934, he took command of small detention facilities where political enemies disappeared into silence. By 1936, he commanded Columbia House in Berlin. The camp was a training ground for SS methods. Prisoners were beaten for minor infractions. Some never left. Karl kept meticulous records and ensured that visitors saw only order and discipline. Behind closed doors, he refined techniques of terror that would later define the concentration camp system. He was charming when required, and savage when useful. He knew how to flatter superiors and crush subordinates. At a party function in the spring of 1936, he noticed a secretary with red hair and watchful eyes. Ilse Koch was presentable and practical. She asked no difficult questions, and she understood hierarchy and loyalty. Within months, Karl Otto Koch had found his second wife, and Ilse had found her path to power. The ceremony took place in the summer of 1936. Ilse Koch became Ilse Koch beneath banners bearing the crooked cross. SS officers in black uniforms stood at attention. Party officials offered congratulations with raised arms. There was no church. The new Germany had found new rituals. Karl wore his decorations proudly. His bride wore white and smiled when expected. The marriage was practical above all else. Karl needed a respectable wife who understood obedience and discretion. Ilse needed security and a place in the rising order. Love was never mentioned. It was unnecessary. Within weeks, they settled into the rhythm of SS life. Karl received new assignments, and they moved accordingly. First to Esterwagen, what then to Sachsenburg in Saxony, where Karl took command of an early concentration camp. Ilse managed the household and learned her role. She hosted dinners for officers and their wives. She dressed appropriately and spoke only when addressed. She deferred to Karl in all visible matters. But she was watching, always watching. From the windows of their quarters, she could see the prisoner barracks. Men in striped uniforms labored in the yards. Guards shouted orders and sometimes raised their clubs. Ilse observed without expression. She noted how fear moved through the rows of inmates. She saw how power operated in its rawest form. The strong commanded. The weak obeyed or suffered. This was the natural order the party had promised to restore. Ilse did not look away from the beatings. When she did not close the curtains, when shots echoed across the compound, she simply watched and learned. Something within her was awakening, something patient and cold. The Ettersberg rises gently from the Thuringian countryside. Beech forests blanket its slopes in green, so deep it appears almost black beneath summer clouds. A century earlier, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe had walked these woods composing verses and contemplating the heights of human possibility. The oak tree beneath which he sat and wrote still stood in 1937. That July, Karl Otto Koch arrived to build something new among the ancient trees. Buchenwald, the forest of beeches. The name carried poetry, but the purpose was pure brutality. Koch commanded prisoners to construct their own prison. Political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, criminals, Jews. When they cleared the forest with hand tools and hauled stone from a quarry that would claim countless lives. Rations were calculated to sustain work. but not strength. Men collapsed and were left where they fell. The dead were stacked like timber until the crematorium could be completed. Ilse arrived in autumn and found a comfortable villa waiting in the SS residential compound. The house had running water and electricity, and a garden where flowers might grow. From her windows, she could see the watchtowers and the smoke rising from the construction site. She could hear the distant rhythm of labor and the occasional crack of gunfire that meant another escape attempt had failed or another quota had been enforced. The commandant's wife settled into her new role, and she arranged furniture and hired prisoner servants and planned menus for officers' dinners. The Oak of Goethe still stood within the camp perimeter. Prisoners passed it daily on their way to die. Enlightenment and extermination shared the same ground now, and Ilse Koch walked between them without pause. The days at Buchenwald settled into routine. Ilse managed the household with precision. She directed the prisoner servants who cleaned and cooked and tended the gardens. She ordered supplies and balanced accounts and ensured that every dinner party reflected proper SS standards. Officers and their wives gathered at the commandant's villa to drink wine and discuss the progress of the Reich, while prisoners starved beyond the garden walls. In 1938, Ilse gave birth to her first child. Motherhood did not soften her, and if anything, it sharpened her need for control. She hired prisoner nannies and returned quickly to her routines, but domesticity was not enough. The camp itself called to her. She began riding her horse through the compound each morning. The official reason was exercise. The truth was something else. Survivors who endured those years later testified to what they witnessed. The commandant's wife rode slowly past the morning roll calls. She studied the rows of prisoners with an expression that betrayed nothing. Sometimes she stopped. Sometimes she pointed. Prisoner Andreas Pfaffenberger would later recall that she carried a riding crop and used it freely on any inmate who failed to show proper deference. Another survivor described how she ordered 25 lashes for a man who accidentally met her gaze. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns. Ilse Koch was discovering something about herself in the suffering of others. She found pleasure in being feared. Power was no longer something she observed from windows. It was something she wielded with her own hands, and each act of cruelty fed an appetite that would only grow. Block 2 stood apart from the main prisoner barracks. Its walls were thick and its windows small, and what happened inside was recorded in careful medical terminology. The Buchenwald Pathology Department served many purposes. Autopsies determined official causes of death for the records. Experiments tested the limits of human endurance for the advancement of German science, and certain specimens were preserved for study or display. Dr. Erich Wagner oversaw these operations with clinical detachment, and he was an SS physician trained to see prisoners not as patients, but as material. Racial ideology had transformed medicine into a weapon. The unfit were studied so the fit might thrive. The subhuman were dissected so the master race might understand its own superiority. Wagner developed particular interest in tattooed skin. Inmates arrived at Buchenwald bearing elaborate designs: ships and eagles, women and dragons, names and dates from lives that no longer mattered. When these prisoners died, their skin was removed with surgical precision. Wagner perfected techniques for tanning and preserving the specimens. The leather that resulted was soft and pliable. Tattoos remained visible beneath the treatment. He kept samples in jars and folders. He displayed some in his office as curiosities. The practice was not secret. Other SS officers knew, or some requested pieces for themselves. This was the machinery that existed before Ilse Koch ever pointed at a prisoner and admired his tattoos. The infrastructure of horror was already built. The bureaucracy of dehumanization already functioned. She did not create the system. She simply recognized what it offered and reached out to take what she wanted. Morning roll call at Buchenwald was a ritual of survival. Prisoners stood in rows for hours while guards counted and recounted, winter or summer, rain or frost. The weak collapsed and were dragged away. The strong endured and hoped to remain invisible. But invisibility became impossible when the commandant's wife appeared. Survivor Joseph Ackermann testified at the Dachau trials about what he witnessed. The woman rode her horse slowly through the assembled prisoners. She wore riding clothes and an expression of casual interest. Her eyes moved across the rows, studying bare arms and chests, where shirts had been torn open by guards. When she saw a tattoo that pleased her, she would pause. Sometimes she pointed with her riding crop. Sometimes she simply nodded toward a guard. That prisoner was marked. Nothing happened immediately. The system was patient. Days passed, perhaps weeks. Then the marked man would be summoned to the infirmary for examination. He would not return. Abraham Bornstein provided similar testimony before West German investigators years later. He described a prisoner named Lehmann who bore an elaborate sailing ship across his back. Ilse Koch spotted him during a summer roll call in 1940. She circled him on horseback. She spoke to a guard. 3 weeks later, Lehmann was dead, and his body went to the pathology block. His skin was never seen again. These accounts multiplied across the post-war trials. Different witnesses, different victims. The same pattern, she pointed. They died. Their tattoos were preserved. And Ilse Koch added another piece to her collection. The preserved skin did not remain in jars. It was crafted into objects of daily use. SS prisoners with leatherworking skills were assigned to transform the tanned specimens into functional items. Lampshades stretched across wire frames, book covers embossed and fitted, gloves stitched with care, photo album bindings decorated with patterns that had once adorned living men. These objects circulated among Buchenwald officers as curiosities and gifts. Some were displayed openly in the commandant's residence. When American soldiers liberated the camp in 1945, they seized several items and submitted them for forensic analysis. Army pathologists confirmed that certain lampshades and other artifacts were made from human skin. Tattoos remained visible beneath the surface treatment. The evidence seemed irrefutable. Yet history is never simple. In subsequent decades, some researchers questioned the provenance of specific items. Forensic tests on certain surviving artifacts yielded inconclusive or contradictory results. Some specimens initially identified as human were later determined to be goat skin. Holocaust deniers seized upon these ambiguities to discredit the entire accusation. But the core truth remained supported by multiple pillars of evidence. Survivor testimonies from separate trials described the same practices. SS personnel confirmed the existence of the tanning operation. Allied investigators documented the pathology block procedures, and photographs from Liberation Day showed objects whose origins were unmistakable. Some claims may have been exaggerated in the chaos of post-war justice, but Ilse Koch requested tattooed skin. She received finished items. She displayed trophies made from murdered prisoners in her home. The essential accusation stands on evidence that controversy cannot erase. The Reich demanded order in all things, including its machinery of death. Murder was sanctioned. Theft was not. This distinction would prove fatal for Karl Otto Koch. By 1941, whispers had reached Berlin about irregularities at Buchenwald. Prisoner laborers were being contracted to private enterprises, and the fees were not reaching official accounts. Valuables confiscated from inmates were disappearing before proper cataloging. Gold fillings extracted from corpses were unaccounted for. The SS launched an internal investigation. Not because prisoners were dying in the thousands, but because someone was stealing from the Reich. SS Judge Konrad Morgan was assigned to the case. He was a lawyer who believed in rules even within a lawless system. His investigation uncovered systematic corruption at the highest levels of Buchenwald command. Karl Otto Koch had built a personal empire on embezzled funds. He used prisoner labor for private construction projects. He sold camp supplies on the black market. He maintained slush funds hidden from auditors. Ilse was implicated as well. Witnesses testified that she received jewelry and furs confiscated from prisoners. She ordered luxury goods purchased with diverted funds. The comfortable villa and elegant dinner parties were financed by theft from the dead. Morgan documented everything with prosecutorial precision. The tattooed skin and the lampshades appeared in his files, but only as peripheral details. The SS hierarchy did not care about preserved specimens or selected prisoners. They cared about missing gold. The murder of thousands warranted no investigation. The theft of Reichsmarks demanded justice. Such was the moral architecture of the Reich that built Buchenwald. Konrad Morgan was a man of impossible contradictions. He wore the SS uniform and believed in the rule of law. He served a regime built on murder and prosecuted killers within its ranks. Understanding him requires abandoning simple categories of hero and villain. Born in 1909, Morgan studied law and joined the SS in 1933. He became a judge within the SS court system, tasked with maintaining discipline and order among the black uniformed elite. He took this role seriously. When assigned to investigate Buchenwald, he expected to find financial irregularities. He found an empire of death. Morgan interviewed prisoners who had witnessed executions without authorization. He documented murders committed for personal satisfaction rather than policy. He traced the flow of stolen valuables from dead inmates to living officers. Karl Otto Koch was not merely corrupt. He was a murderer even by SS standards. Morgan built his case methodically. He gathered testimony. He preserved documents. He followed evidence wherever it led, including into the commandant's household. As Ilse Koch appeared repeatedly in witness statements, her selections, her cruelty, her collection. Morgan recorded it all. The paradox of his position never resolved itself. He prosecuted individual crimes while the greater crime continued uninterrupted around him. He upheld regulations within a system designed for extermination. After the war, he testified at Nuremberg, describing what he had found. His evidence helped convict officers who might otherwise have escaped. But his own complicity remained. Konrad Morgan enforced rules in a world that had abandoned all moral law. History remembers him as neither hero nor villain, but something more troubling. A man who believed in justice while serving injustice. The transfer came in 1941. Karl Otto Koch was reassigned to Majdanek near Lublin in occupied Poland. The move was not a promotion. Berlin was already aware of irregularities at Buchenwald, and distance served as temporary solution while investigators gathered evidence. Ilse accompanied her husband eastward into the heart of the killing fields. Majdanek was different from Buchenwald. It stood at the intersection of concentration camp and extermination center. Gas chambers operated alongside forced labor operations. The dead numbered in tens of thousands. Jews from the Lublin ghetto, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians deemed enemies of the Reich. The scale of murder dwarfed anything Ilse had witnessed before. Yet patterns repeated themselves. Karl continued his financial schemes. Prisoner labor was contracted and fees diverted. Valuables disappeared into private accounts. The corruption that had flourished at Buchenwald took root in Polish soil. Yet Ilse continued her rituals. Survivors from Majdanek would later offer testimonies that echoed those from Germany. A woman on horseback moving through the camp, watching prisoners with unsettling attention, pointing at those whose bodies bore interesting marks. The selections continued. The cruelty remained constant, but Morgan's investigation was closing in. Documents accumulated in SS files. Witnesses provided statements. The case against Karl Otto Koch grew stronger with each passing month. In August 1943, he was arrested by SS authorities and charged with embezzlement, murder, and other offenses. Ilse was taken into custody shortly afterward. The Witch of Buchenwald would finally face judgment. Though not the judgment history would ultimately demand, the SS tried its own with meticulous formality. Courtrooms convened, evidence presented, and verdicts rendered, all while the machinery of genocide continued uninterrupted beyond the chamber doors. Karl Otto Koch stood before an SS tribunal in 1944, facing charges that would have seemed absurd in any other context. Embezzlement, corruption, unauthorized killings. The Reich that murdered millions prosecuted him for stealing from the dead and killing without proper authorization. The trial proceeded with legalistic precision. Witnesses testified. Documents were examined. Morgan's investigation provided damning evidence of systematic theft and personal enrichment. The murders mattered less than the money, but they strengthened the case. Karl was found guilty, sentenced to death. He remained in SS custody as appeals wound through the bureaucracy. But in April 1945, with Allied forces closing on Buchenwald, a firing squad executed Karl Otto Koch. He died days before American soldiers liberated the camp he had built. Ilse faced separate proceedings. The charges against her focused on receiving stolen property and benefiting from her husband's corruption. Prosecutors could not prove direct participation in specific killings. The selections, the pointing, the tattooed skin. All of this appeared in testimony, but none of it constituted legally sufficient evidence of murder under SS court standards. She was acquitted in 1944 and released. The woman who rode through roll calls choosing which prisoners would die walked free. Her husband was executed for theft. She was absolved despite survivors who watched her condemn men with a gesture. Such was justice under the crooked cross. And the Reich crumbled in fire and ash. By April 1945, Allied forces pressed from west and east, while German cities burned beneath endless bombardment. At Buchenwald, the SS prepared to flee. Officers destroyed documents, guards abandoned posts. The machinery of death ground to a halt, not from mercy, but from collapse. Ilse Koch gathered her children and whatever valuables she could carry. She left the comfortable villa overlooking the camp where she had lived for 8 years. She did not look back at the crematorium chimneys or the prisoner barracks or the pathology block where tattooed skin had been transformed into household objects. She looked only forward toward survival. Her plan was simple: disappear into the chaos of defeated Germany, become another refugee among millions, unshed the identity of the commandant's wife, and emerge as an ordinary woman with ordinary children seeking shelter in extraordinary times. She made her way south, eventually settling in Ludwigsburg under her maiden name. She told neighbors nothing of Buchenwald. She waited for the storm to pass. But the hunters were already gathering names. American intelligence units compiled lists of wanted war criminals from captured documents and survivor testimonies. Buchenwald prisoners liberated in April spoke to investigators. They described the woman on horseback, Die Hexe, the witch. They provided her name and description. Ilse Koch appeared on arrest lists distributed across occupied Germany. On June 30, 1945, American military police located her in Ludwigsburg. She offered no resistance, and the woman who had once pointed at prisoners and watched them disappear was now herself in custody. Justice delayed was finally beginning. The courtroom at Dachau had witnessed justice and vengeance intertwined since the war ended. American military tribunals processed thousands of accused war criminals within the same walls where prisoners had suffered. In 1947, Ilse Koch sat before the judges as perhaps the most notorious defendant yet to face Allied justice. The charges were comprehensive: participation in a criminal enterprise, incitement to murder, cruelty and mistreatment of prisoners. Prosecutors built their case methodically, presenting physical evidence and human testimony in equal measure. The lampshades were displayed before the court. Experts confirmed their composition. Photographs from Liberation Day showed the objects in the commandant's quarters. Documents traced the pathology block operations. But the most powerful evidence came from the survivors themselves. Men who had stood in those roll calls took the witness stand. They described the woman on horseback in unflinching detail. They named fellow prisoners who had been selected and never returned. Josef Ackermann testified. Abraham Bornstein testified. Others whose names history has not preserved spoke of what they witnessed. The trial became a media sensation. Newspapers across America and Europe reported daily proceedings. The public finally confronted the full horror of what had occurred in the camps. Ilse Koch became a symbol of Nazi cruelty. The prosecution demanded the maximum penalty. The tribunal deliberated and returned its verdict. Guilty on all counts, sentenced to life imprisonment. For a moment, justice seemed complete. Survivors wept. Headlines proclaimed accountability. The witch of Buchenwald would spend her remaining years behind bars, or so the world believed. The news arrived like a second betrayal. In 1948, General Lucius Clay reviewed the sentences of convicted war criminals as part of his authority as U.S. military governor of Germany. When he reached the case of Ilse Koch, he made a decision that would ignite outrage across 2 continents. Her life sentence was reduced to 4 years. She would be eligible for release almost immediately. Clay's reasoning was technical and precise. The evidence presented at trial did not definitively prove that Ilse Koch had directly ordered specific murders, and the lampshades could not be conclusively linked to her personal requests. Witness testimonies established her presence and cruelty, but fell short of proving command responsibility for individual deaths. Under strict legal standards, the life sentence was disproportionate to what had been proven beyond doubt. The decision was legally defensible. It was also morally catastrophic. American newspapers erupted in condemnation. Headlines demanded explanation. Jewish organizations mobilized protests across the country. Survivors who had testified watched in disbelief as their tormentor prepared to walk free. Congress launched formal hearings into the commutation. Senators demanded answers from military officials. The American public confronted an uncomfortable truth about the limits of justice. Behind the controversy lay deeper forces. And the Cold War was reshaping priorities. Germany was becoming an ally against Soviet expansion. Denazification had grown exhausting and inconvenient. Pragmatism whispered that rebuilding required forgetting. Ilse Koch became a symbol of compromised justice. The woman who selected men for death based on their tattoos would serve barely 4 years. The survivors who endured Buchenwald would carry their wounds forever. Ilse Koch walked out of Landsberg prison in October 1949, having served the reduced sentence that General Clay had granted. She was 43 years old. She returned to Bavaria, hoping to disappear once more into civilian anonymity. She found lodging in a small town. She avoided public attention. She waited for memory to fade, as it so often does. But the survivors had not forgotten. What public pressure mounted in both America and the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany. Jewish organizations demanded accountability. Newspapers continued reporting on the woman who had escaped justice. West German authorities faced an impossible choice between pragmatic silence and moral reckoning. They chose reckoning. In 1949, Bavarian prosecutors opened a new case against Ilse Koch under German criminal law. The charges differed from the American trial. Incitement to murder in 135 cases. Accessory to murder. Crimes against humanity. The focus narrowed to specific incidents that German investigators could document through available evidence. She was arrested again before she could establish a new life. The trial began in Augsburg in November 1950. West German justice was imperfect, as many perpetrators escaped prosecution through bureaucratic failures or political convenience. Judges who had served the Nazi regime now sat in courtrooms of the new democracy. But the Koch case demonstrated that some accountability remained possible. The machinery ground slowly forward. Witnesses were summoned. Evidence was examined. The woman who had believed herself beyond consequences faced judgment once more. This time there would be no American general to reduce her sentence. The trial in Augsburg lasted months. Ilse Koch sat in the defendant's dock while prosecutors built their case with painstaking precision. Survivor after survivor took the witness stand. They described the morning roll calls, the woman on horseback, the pointing that meant death. They named the dead when they could remember names and described them when they could not. 111 cases of incitement to murder. Each count represented a man whose tattooed skin had caught her eye. Expert witnesses testified about the pathology block operations. Documentary evidence traced the flow of preserved specimens from morgue to craftsman to the commandant's household. The defense offered arguments that would echo through war crimes trials for decades. She was merely the commandant's wife. She held no official position. She gave no formal orders. Whatever happened at Buchenwald occurred under her husband's authority, not hers. She was present, but not responsible. The court rejected this reasoning entirely. Presence with power constituted participation. Her selections directly caused deaths even without signed execution orders. The pointing finger carried the authority of the commandant's household. Guilty on all counts, sentenced to life imprisonment. Ilse Koch appealed the verdict. German appellate courts reviewed the proceedings and found no reversible error. The conviction stood. In 1951, she entered Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria. The gates closed behind her. She was 45 years old. Outside the walls, Germany rebuilt itself. The economic miracle transformed cities. A new generation grew up in peace. Inside Aichach, time moved differently. Ilse Koch would never breathe free air again. The walls of Aichach Women's Prison became her world. 16 years passed within their confines. Each day followed the same rhythm: wake at prescribed hours, meals at prescribed times, exercise in prescribed spaces. The woman who once rode horseback through columns of prisoners now walked narrow corridors under the eyes of guards who knew exactly who she was. Ilse Koch refused to accept her fate. She wrote endless letters to authorities proclaiming her innocence. Petitions for pardon arrived at government offices year after year. Each was reviewed. Each was denied. She claimed the witnesses had lied. She insisted the evidence was fabricated. She portrayed herself as victim of vengeful survivors and overzealous prosecutors. Never once did she acknowledge what she had done. Psychiatric evaluations noted her deteriorating mental state as the years accumulated. Depression settled into her features. Paranoia colored her perceptions. She believed conspiracies surrounded her imprisonment. Yet beneath the psychological decline, her core conviction remained unchanged. She was innocent. The dead were not her responsibility. The selections meant nothing. The skin had nothing to do with her. Her children grew up under assumed names, shielded from the notoriety of their mother. As they reached adulthood, they distanced themselves from her shadow. Visits became infrequent, then rare, then nearly non-existent. Germany moved forward. The economic miracle rebuilt cities and lives. A new generation asked uncomfortable questions about their parents. But Ilse Koch remained frozen in time, forgotten by a nation eager to forget, bitter and isolated in her cell, waiting for a pardon that would never come. History does not remain static. While decades after liberation, scholars began re-examining the evidence surrounding Ilse Koch with the critical distance that time allows. Some findings complicated the narrative that had emerged from the immediate post-war trials. Forensic analysis of surviving artifacts yielded inconsistent results. Certain items seized in 1945 and identified as human skin were later tested and found to be goat skin or other animal leather. Chain of custody questions arose about specific objects. Some witnesses had provided testimony under duress or had conflated separate incidents in memory. These ambiguities attracted those eager to exploit them. Holocaust deniers seized upon every inconsistency as proof of fabrication. They argued that the entire lampshade story was Allied propaganda designed to demonize Germany. That they claimed Ilse Koch was merely a convenient villain created to satisfy demands for vengeance. This exploitation of legitimate historical inquiry for malicious purposes requires careful distinction. The core accusations against Ilse Koch rest on foundations that withstand scrutiny. Multiple independent witnesses from different trials described identical patterns of selection. SS personnel confirmed the pathology block operations. Dr. Wagner's preservation techniques were documented before Ilse's involvement became central to the narrative. Some human skin artifacts were conclusively verified through testing. The practice existed even if specific items remain disputed. Legitimate scholarship asks difficult questions without predetermined conclusions. Bad faith denialism begins with conclusions and distorts questions to reach them. Thus, Ilse Koch participated in selecting prisoners whose tattoos she admired. Those prisoners died. Their skin was preserved and transformed. These facts endure beyond any debate about individual lampshades. The morning of September 1st, 1967, began like any other at Ilse prison. Guards made their rounds. Breakfast was prepared. The routines that had governed 16 years continued without variation. When a guard approached cell 17 to conduct the morning check, she found the door unresponsive. Inside, Ilse Koch hung from a bedsheet knotted to the cell window frame. She was 60 years old. Prison officials reconstructed her final days through records and staff observations. Her most recent pardon petition had been denied weeks earlier. The rejection was routine by then. Decades of letters and appeals had yielded nothing but form responses, and her children had not visited in months. Correspondence had dwindled to near silence. She had complained of various ailments and requested medical attention that records suggest was provided. Nothing indicated imminent crisis, yet crisis had been building for years. Isolation, bitterness, the absolute refusal of the world to accept her version of events. The conviction that she alone understood the truth, while everyone else conspired against her. Psychiatric evaluations had documented declining stability, but nothing that mandated intervention. She left no suicide note, no confession, no final words explaining her choice or acknowledging her crimes. The silence was complete. The woman who had once commanded fear with a pointed finger died without witness or declaration, no redemption, no remorse, but only an ending as empty as the cell she left behind. Guards cut down the body. Paperwork was completed. The world outside barely noticed. Ilse Koch was buried in an unmarked grave. History moved on. Buchenwald stands today as a memorial. Visitors walk paths where prisoners once marched to their deaths. The crematorium remains preserved behind glass. The gate still bears its inscription. Jedem das Seine. To each what he deserves. The words were designed to be read from inside the camp. A final cruelty visible to those who would not survive to see justice. Ilse Koch died alone in a prison cell, having never acknowledged what she did. Her case offers no comfortable lessons. She was not a monster born different from the rest of humanity. When she was a secretary from Dresden, who joined a political party for practical reasons and married an ambitious officer, and discovered that power over life and death intoxicated her. She made choices. Each choice led to another. Each step deeper into darkness seemed smaller than the last, until she stood in the abyss wondering how she had arrived. The post-war trials convicted her, but justice remained incomplete. Thousands of perpetrators escaped accountability entirely. Guards who swung clubs, doctors who conducted experiments, administrators who signed transport orders, neighbors who looked away. How many Ilse Kochs walked unnamed into the peace that followed? How many lived ordinary lives and died ordinary deaths, while their victims remained ash and memory? Somewhere in an archive, a lampshade rests, sealed in acid-free tissue. A faded tattoo of a dragon is still visible beneath decades of preservation. A man's skin, a woman's choice, and history's refusal to forget. The camps are gone now. The perpetrators are dead. But the questions they left behind will outlive us all. What darkness lives in ordinary hearts? And what would we do if given permission to unleash it?